Okay, hi. We're looking at politics, and I'm not really focusing on specific issues right now. I'm just focusing on general attitudes we need to be aware of. And today I want to talk about the phenomenon of a pendulum swing. If we're going to understand how to handle politics and voting and lobbying and everything else in our day, we need to understand the phenomenon of the pendulum swing. So here's the verse I'm sort of using for this section of teachings. It says in 1 Chronicles 12, of the sons of Issachar, that they were men who understood the times with knowledge of what Israel should do. And that was what made them particularly valuable and noteworthy as part of David's army. And in the same way today, if we want to be fighting the spiritual battle and being effective in our ministry and effective as a church in the world around us, one of the things we need is people who understand the times, people who have knowledge of what we should do based on understanding the times. That certainly applies politically. So one of the things I want to talk about today is understanding how the pendulum swing works. So here's a famous quote from, people say it's by Martin Luther, but I did a little investigation and apparently it probably isn't by Martin Luther. But whoever it's by, here's what it says. It says, if I profess with the loudest voice and clearest exposition every portion of the truth of God except precisely that little point which the world and the devil are at that moment attacking, I am not confessing Christ. However boldly I may be professing Christ. Where the battle rages, there the loyalty of the soldier is proved. And to be steady on all the battlefield besides is mere flight and disgrace if he flinches at that point. What this is saying is Satan's attacking at certain key points in our culture, in our churches, in our world. And we need to be fighting where the fight is, not just going off and worrying about, some other minor point that has nothing to do with anything. We need to be where the fight actually is. All right, so that's a good quote, and if that's the way you understand it, that's good. But it has been misunderstood, and it's kind of incomplete, because if you take it as it is and don't think about the full scope of what's happening, you'll get this wrong. And I usually see this quoted by people who say, see, you need to stop teaching and preaching what you have been preaching, and you need to just focus on combating the world's wrong view of gay rights or whatever else. Because that's the place where the world is attacking. All right, so here's what I want to point out. Why is this not quite correct? Well, because it misunderstands something. It makes it sound like Satan is only attacking at one point, that there's this one point that the church is defending, and it's that little point over there in the diagram. But Satan is not going to attack just at one point at one time. Satan also attacks at other points. So the world will push us on one point, and in the meantime, Satan will also attack on the other side and try to push us to get things wrong there as well. So it's not actually correct that there's just one precise point on which Satan is attacking and we need to defend that one. Sometimes there's an opposite point that he's also attacking in. Satan is a master tactician, and he loves to attack us from many points at once. So particularly what Satan has a habit of doing, and I think if you watch, you'll see this happening, is he has a habit of pushing us to an extreme by getting us to do a pendulum swing. So the world is over here pushing in one direction and really going to an extreme, saying things and pushing for things that we would never have, that people would never have accepted a few decades ago. But now we look, and for some reason we're all carried away. And then what he wants to do is to get us to swing clear to the other extreme and be just as wrong in the other direction, or at least partially wrong in the other direction, in reaction against what the world is doing. And when this happens, it's not helpful to say to people merely, make sure you fight where Satan's attacking, because he's attacking on both sides. He's getting the world to go really, really wrong in one direction, and then at the same time he comes along and tries to entice us into going wrong in the other direction. This means we have to really have wisdom. We have to have balance. That somehow we have to work all that out. So there's this idea of a pendulum swing. You can see this. Yeah, you can see this actually in Scripture in a lot of different places. Just a little minor place. Think about Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 5, we see that the Corinthian church was going way overboard on sexual immorality. They were accepting all sorts of things that even the world didn't accept. And Paul reproves them for that. Says, why are you letting the world push you into being so accepting of so many sexually wrong things? And in chapter 6, he makes the same point. He says, don't you know that this is not who you are anymore? And then in chapter 7, he starts saying, is it okay for people to get married? And then says yes. Now, what in the world? 2 chapters ago, they were accepting a man sleeping with his mother-in-law. Chapter 7, there's apparently people who are thinking you shouldn't even be married because to do so would be impure. And he's saying, no, 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 being married is okay. Well, what's happening is, in Corinth, there was one group of believers who were wanting to say anything goes as far as sexual depravity and promiscuity and everything else. And at the same time, there was another group of believers trying to shut down even marriage because they were saying that's not good. That shouldn't surprise us. It's the kind of thing that always happens. When one group goes way out of bounds in one direction, the other group will tend to overreact in the other direction. So Scripture constantly calls us to be discerning and to be wise and to be balanced. So let's talk about how we can be sure to be balanced in the way we respond to the extremes of the world without falling into an extreme of our own in overreaction. 3 things I think that can help me avoid the pendulum swing if I'm worried about it. Number 1 is to remember my audience. Number 2 is to remember my gifting. And number 3 is to be especially alert to, especially discerning of the errors that are on both sides of the pendulum, of the error of extremism particularly. So let's talk about each of these. Number 1, remember my audience. Proverbs has this amazing passage which says, like apples of gold in settings of silver is a word spoken in right circumstances. Like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold is a wise reprover to a listening ear. What this is saying is, it's great when you have apples, when you have the right words. It's great when you have truth and love and know just how to say something. You can say it wisely. But part of what you need is for the circumstances to be right. It's not just having a word to speak. It's having it to speak in the right circumstances. And that's like having apples of gold in settings of silver. It's like he's thinking about jewelry. If you take a little piece of gold and put it inside a silver setting, it makes it even more beautiful. And then in the second verse, he says, it's like having an earring gold and an ornament of fine gold. That's like the earring, and then it goes on your ear. And in the same way, your reproof, the wise reproof, hopefully is in the right circumstances to have a listening ear. So what he's saying is, you don't just say something just because it's true. You say it because it's true and it's the right timing. You say it because it's true and it's the right circumstance. Now, that doesn't mean you can only speak when people are ready to listen. Sometimes you need to speak to people who are not ready to listen. But you need to speak with discernment about, is this the right time? Sometimes it's not the time to speak. Sometimes it is the time to speak. And what happens is we sometimes get to thinking that if there's anything to say, I just have to say it. And that's not necessarily true. The wise man knows, when am I in the right circumstance to speak? When am I not? So I need to remember my audience. Who am I talking to? Is this the right circumstance? Here's another verse, which sort of brings out the same thing. This isn't directly about it, but you can see the same principle. In 1 Thessalonians 5, Paul says, we urge you, brethren, admonish the unruly, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with everyone. Notice he talks about 3 different things, about admonishing, about encouraging, about helping, for 3 different groups of people. And he says what you do with each person depends on who they are, on where their heart is, what they're ready for. If they're unruly, if they're disobeying and being careless and just undisciplined, you may need to admonish them. If they're faint-hearted, don't admonish them. That will just destroy them. If they're faint-hearted, give them courage. Encourage them. And if they're weak, you can encourage and motivate them all they want, but what they need from you is help. They need you to help them see how to do what they need to do. So Aaron talked last Sunday about the fact that the Pharisees put heavy burdens on people and then never tried to help them. We need to be careful to see who we're speaking to and do the right thing with the right person. So if you're unruly and I try to encourage or to help you, I'm not really doing you any good at all. I need to admonish you. But if you're faint-hearted and I try to admonish you, I'll destroy you. What I need to do instead is to encourage you. And if you're weak, you need help. And I need to think with each person, what is the right circumstances for what I want to say? And what is the right thing to say for these circumstances? And what is the right timing? And what kind of person am I speaking to? Notice that for all of them, it takes patience. For everybody, it takes patience. So I don't want to push this too far, but I think this principle is an important one as we think about speaking wisely. So what does this mean? It means when I ask, what battle am I supposed to be fighting? Am I supposed to be defending against the world pushing to one extreme or the church going to another extreme? It depends on who I'm talking to. It depends on what my audience is. In particular, if I'm teaching to the church, I don't need to be preaching at the world. I need to be teaching the church. I need to think about where's the church going wrong? Where's the church making mistakes? If I'm in a Sunday school class, I need to think about who's in this Sunday school class. What do they need to be encouraged with or challenged with? And not what does my neighbor who's somewhere else need to be encouraged or challenged with. On the other hand, when I turn around and speak with the world, I need to be thinking, what are they ready for? What do they need to be encouraged with or admonished with or whatever else? So in every case, I need to ask, what's this audience and what do they require? In 1 Corinthians 5, after talking about how wrong the church was for just going along with the world's really lax standards sexually, Paul says, you guys need to shut that down. And then he says, for what have I to do with judging outsiders? Don't you judge those who are within the church? Those who are outside, God judges. So he says, when you are in the church, the thing you should be focusing on is judging those within the church. You should be focusing on the people who say they are Christians. What are they saying? What are they doing? Sometimes we get caught up sitting around with each other, judging the people out there. And that may not be where Satan is attacking us. That may not be where the battle is raging within our own walls. So one of the things that I think we need to realize is it's not necessarily always our job to just be preaching about how wrong the people are out there. We need to be asking, what do we need to learn? What do we need to be challenged with? What do we need to be encouraged with? Okay. This also relates, though, to the next idea, which is remembering my gifting. The point I have here is we're not just one soldier. There's a lot of us. I'll come back to this in a minute. I'm not the only one speaking for Christ. You are too. You're not the only one speaking for Christ. I am too. We don't all have to say the same thing. We don't all have to target the same error. I can focus on one error. You can focus on another so that we can hit both battlefronts. You can be over fighting where the world is really going wrong, and I can be over fighting where the church is going to the opposite extreme, and we can be working for the same thing in the same army. We're just fighting Satan on two fronts at once. And so part of what I have to do is ask, what am I called to do? A lot of people like to say, John the Baptist spoke out against all these things. We should all be like John the Baptist. I think if you're called to be John the Baptist, you should be like John the Baptist. If you're called to be like that, I think you should do that. But we all have different gifting. So I want to show you a funny little verse that kind of brings this out. Jesus says to his listeners, to what shall I compare this generation? It's like children sitting in the marketplaces who call out to the other children and say, we played the flute for you, you didn't dance. We sang a dirge, and you didn't mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, behold, a gluttonous man and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. What he's saying is, John came with one gifting and one style, you didn't listen to him. I came with another gifting and another style, you didn't listen to me. The problem is not us, the problem is you. But along the way, he has this point that John came like one playing a dirge. He came abstaining from all sorts of different things, staying out in the desert and being very harsh and austere. And that was part of his calling, and it was part of how God used him. He says, but I came and I have a different ministry, and I'm eating and drinking and eating with tax gatherers and sinners, and everybody's like, you're not austere enough. Well, this is where my call is. And then he's making the point that he and John are not against each other. He and John are both making the same points. They're preaching the same gospel. They just have a different calling and a different gifting. And God is using them both, and they're both being rejected in different ways by those who don't want to listen. So in the same way, you may be a John the Baptist. You may be somebody coming with a dirge. You may be like Jesus was here, coming with a flute and something to sing to. You may be preaching harsh things. You may be preaching exciting, positive things, and hopefully a balance of all of it. But each of us will have a different calling, a different ministry. And that's one of the things I have to ask. What am I called to do? It's interesting. A couple times I've tried to teach something where I was more focused on reproof. And very often when I go to do that, I realize afterwards it didn't go very well. And I'm realizing that that's just not usually how God calls me to teach. Usually he calls me to teach positively and encouragement. I don't think that means that people can't preach reproof or teach reproof. I think I may occasionally be called to do that, but I'm learning that I have a particular gifting of my own, and that's where I need to focus. That's what I need to do. If I want to be in the battle, I need to be in the battle on the front that I'm supposed to be fighting on. Also, this verse in Romans 13:4, sorry, this should be 14:4. I have that wrong. Paul says, who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls. He will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. So figure out where God has called you to serve, figure out what he's called you to say. Don't spend too much time trying to tell the rest of us that we're all supposed to be over there doing what you're doing, because who are you to judge the servant of another? God is able to make us stand, is able to show us what we need to be doing. We can still encourage one another. Just don't take God's place and start sort of trying to order people around. That's usually a bad idea. So the picture is, here's the attacks. One soldier might be over here and another soldier might be over here. And that's how we work together in the body of Christ. The third thing is to be aware of errors on both sides. Okay, so one thing to be aware of in particular is extremism. Satan wants to push us to extremes, whether it's the world's version of the extremes or the church's version of the extremes. He wants us to push away from balance and wisdom. Now, I want to be really clear. Sometimes the middle ground in a position is the wrong one. Sometimes we do need to be extreme about certain things. Being extreme for the right kinds of truth is exactly the right thing sometimes. However, there are dangers to extremism, and we need to be careful about it. And I would like to point out that we know that some of the extremism politically in the last several years has not come from God. It's come from other sources. For example, social media. There was a study done where somebody found that in the last several years, social media has changed significantly. And here's two of the things that have changed. Number one, about 90% of the social media posts come from about 10% of the people. So the social media posts do not represent most people. They represent just a few people, just about 10%. And those 10% are people on the extremes, on both sides, both right and left. And so what you're seeing is not what everybody believes. What you're seeing is what the most extreme people on either side believe. The examples you're seeing of far left are much farther left than your average person is. The examples you're seeing of the far right are much farther right than the average person is. The extremists are the ones doing almost all the posting. And they're doing lots of posting. They're posting 40, 50, 60 posts a day. Nobody else can keep up with them because everybody else has regular jobs to do. These people, this is their job, is to just post provocative things all the time. And the second thing that people found when they studied this is that most of the posts by people on the far left are not aimed at the people on the right. They're aimed at people on the moderate left, saying you are wrong if you're not being as extreme as we are. And most of the posts by people on the far right are not aimed at the left. They're aimed at people on the moderate right, saying you're wrong if you're not as extreme as we are. So most of these are aimed at the people who are trying to be in the middle and saying you need to make yourself more extreme. That's just the nature of social media. And so one of the things that happened is as the extremists have pushed us to be more extreme, we've become more extreme. We've just been manipulated into it. We've just been triggered into it. We've just been pushed into it. It hasn't been a careful, thought-out seeking of the Holy Spirit. It's been being pushed and triggered by people who are provoking us into getting more extreme. Matter of fact, this hasn't even all been human. Some of this has been AI. There's seems to be pretty good evidence that some of the algorithms that were written to increase social media involvement were written to search for whatever kinds of things would produce the most reaction from people, because those get the most engagement, those make the most money. And in order to make money, you need reaction. And in order to get reaction, you need people to care enough to repost and to post other things. And it turns out the best way to do that is to make people angry or afraid. And so we've actually got algorithms that have been learning how to make people angry, learning how to make people afraid. The AI has been manipulating us, finding what our triggers are and finding ways to trigger us. So I don't know about you, but I don't want to let some program somewhere, some algorithm play with my emotions and push me into responses that are not my own or that are normally not my own. So I just think we need to be aware this is what's happening. And this is partly why we've gotten so divisive in the last 8 years. It's not because there was never any disagreement before, is because everything is geared toward trying to push us to extremes. The third thing is, of course, our own flesh pushes us to extremes because anger is self-justifying. When we get angry about somebody, it tells us, and you're perfectly right in being angry, you can't possibly be wrong about this. And fear is leads to things where we self-justify. It's not easy for us to not react to those triggers in a way that just defends and to the death and doubles down on all the things we're going wrong on. So we need to be careful about that. we need to remember especially, and this is what I think I want to close on, we need to remember that my battle is not the same as God's battle. There are battles that I'm fighting that I think have biblical support for them in a certain way. In other words, I think part of what I'm fighting is based on biblical principles, and the other side is based on unbiblical principles. But that doesn't mean that God is fighting the battle I'm fighting. It doesn't mean that God's agenda is my agenda. And it doesn't mean I can't ask for God to help in my battle, but what I can't do is try to make it God's battle when it's not. 2 verses. Joshua 5. Came about when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. This is an angel. Joshua went to him and said, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" All right, we're fighting a battle. There's us and there's the adversaries. Which side are you on? And this man says, "No." Are you for us or for our adversaries? No. Rather, I indeed come now as captain of the host of the Lord. He says, I'm not on your side, Joshua. I'm not on their side, Joshua. Your battle doesn't matter as much as what I'm here for. I'm here as captain of God's army with God's battles. Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his servant?" So Joshua understood at that moment, as important as winning this battle with Jericho will be, as important as winning the battle with whether our other adversaries will be, as much as that was partly what we've been called to as Israelites. Nonetheless, there's a key difference between our fighting our earthly battles for territory in Canaan and following what God calls us to. And we never want to reduce God to our side or their side or our battle or their side of the battle. Our battles are not God's battles. We're here to do his will and to do what he's saying. Jesus says something very similar in this story. The Pharisees went and plotted together how they might trap Jesus in what he said. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians with this trap. They said, "Teacher, we know that you're truthful and teach the way of God in truth and defer to no one, for you're not partial to any. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not?" So here's what happened. In their day, the culture war, the political battle, which was very intense, was did Rome have the right to claim a poll tax from Jerusalem and from the Israelites? And it had a lot to do with whether they were losing their freedoms or not, and what kinds of rights they had, and were they God's people? And people were on both sides. One group of people was like, we should not have to pay this. This is wrong for the Gentiles to lord this over us. We are God's people. And the other side was, this is not an issue we should get ourselves killed for. This is just, it's okay to pay the poll tax. And and they were on the other side. And there's these two sides going on, and they came and they were trying to trap Jesus by forcing him to pick a side. And the reason they wanted him to pick a side is because he had followers on both sides. And they knew if he would say, we are supposed to pay the poll tax, then all the people who were against doing it would leave him. And if he said, we're not supposed to pay the poll tax, then first of all the people who thought they should would leave him, but also they could bring the Romans against him. And so he says this, Jesus perceived their malice. He knew that they were not really needing to know which side he was on. They were just trying to trick him or to trap him and to get him into saying something he regretted. He said, why are you testing me, you hypocrites? You're hypocrites. He's saying you're pretending to care about what's right, but you were really just trying to trick me. Show me the coin used for the poll tax. And they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. So he starts by just asking them. He's not making a statement of his own. He just says, whose picture is on this coin? And then he said to them, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Now, it would be a mistake to read this as just saying, pay the poll tax. What he's saying is, you guys are completely missing the point. The point is, God doesn't care much about your money. That's Caesar's. That's the world's. That's just the world's. What God cares about is, are you giving to him what belongs to him? And he's saying, you guys are missing that. Those of you who are paying the poll tax because you want to follow Caesar, it's not about following Caesar, it's about following God. Those of you who are refusing to pay the poll tax because you want to follow God, that's not what God's asking you to do, and it's not what he cares about. What he cares about is what he's calling you to do. He's saying to them, you're making the same mistake as Joshua made. You're saying, are you on our side or their side? And I'm telling you, I'm God's side. I'm on God's side. So he's warning them against having an agenda which is not God's, and then claiming it's God's. It's one thing for me to care about something in my own life, like how much money I'm getting back on taxes or whether I have to pay taxes. That's one thing. And I can I can seek God even as I do that. But to turn around and make that God's issue, to say, because I care about this and I'm following God, therefore this is God's battle, that's kind of like taking the name of the Lord in vain. It's really a blasphemous thing to do. We need to recognize that God's battles are God's battles. So the same thing I think applies to us politically. Whatever we do, we need to be really, really clear that there's a human level political and cultural war going on. And we can fight that war in certain ways, in ways that are biblical, in ways that accord with biblical truth and principles. But what we can't do is equate our battles with God's battles. And that's, again, a basic attitude, a basic stance, a basic belief that will affect everything else I talk about in the next several weeks. So I'll close with that. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more about, I think we'll take an example, I don't know yet, but I think I'll take a specific example of some things that the world says that really put some pressure on us, that kind of guilt us, and that kind of push us to a pendulum swing. We'll kind of work this out in practice. For that specific set of issues, what do we need to avoid as a pendulum swing, but what do we need to avoid in terms of what the world is saying? And we'll sort of look at it that way. So thanks. See you next week.